Uh, in an interview, you were asked why Lincoln himself, and you just said it, did not appear more than 7 scenes. Uh, and you said you were afraid to stray too far from the historical record and gain the ire of us Lincoln aficionados. And here you
Did
are.
I say afraid? I didn't mean that word. If
That's
that's what I said.
what it said. Afraid to stray too far from the historical record. Now, as a Lincoln aficionado, I feel a little bit like Robert Todd Lincoln, actually, who had some pull with Nicolay and Hay in their history.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as a group we must have had some pull there. But did you find it difficult to write for the novelized Lincoln? Was it easier for Ben Wade, for example?
It was difficult to write for Lincoln, although one has the advantage that there's so many wonderful Lincoln sources. That is, when in the dialogue in the 7 scenes in which he appears, almost all of it is either taken from words he actually said or wrote, just moved to a different occasion. Most of it is that, or model in its construction on things he actually said. There's one place in the novel, I'm not going to say where it is, where I actually wrote a paragraph for him that wasn't based on anything else, that was a little bit highfalutin in style. And I don't think that paragraph worked particularly well, so I won't tell anybody where it is. People may come across it. But other than that I largely was sticking to, obviously out of context, but words that he'd said and trying to get the style and the cadence right.
Now, what cadences did you find?
And so, well, it's interesting. Someone asked me, I don't remember where I was. I think I was in Dallas, and there was not a member of Lincoln Nation there, and he was challenging me on how often Lincoln used the word reckon, as in I reckon. He said he thought Lincoln said reckon too much in the novel. And so we talked about that a little bit. I mean, it's interesting that you do read some historians who write Lincoln biographies in which the word reckon never appears, and you read other people who are telling stories about the times with Lincoln in which the word reckon is almost every third word on the page, it seems. And maybe that's right. I'm not going to pretend that I got all the cadences exactly right. But I wasn't trying to create a historically authentic Lincoln. I was trying to create a historically plausible Lincoln. It's just a novel, after all. It's a story in which Lincoln is a character playing a particular role in the story. And for me, what was important was to do it in a way that honored the subject and was as true to the subject as I could manage within the confines of writing fiction.
Well, then I won't get in your case too much for this one. I'm going to show a Lincoln signature here in a letter. And you say in here, it just so happens that you run into an autograph dealer as a Lincoln aficionado also. So here I am looking at Lincoln's signature. And on page 157 to be exact, Lincoln signed his name in a large flourish when relaxed. I have to admit, I kind of never seen a large flourish from him. But of course, by the time he's in your sphere, he's dead. So maybe it's difficult. But I find it somewhat spare and to the point without paroxysms and flourishes. But I just wanted to show one, and it does not take away from
actually, the letter the letter that refers to, I think, is the letter he wrote to Ezra Kinney, who was a clergyman in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. Now, I changed the date on which he wrote it, but if you look at that letter, it's a very unusual Lincoln signature. It's a big looping Lincoln signature. It's in the Library of Congress.
Okay.
I looked at it online. I looked at it online. And
you also at one point say he gets sloppy. Did you see sloppiness?
Right. Oh, that's
out of curiosity.
I'm sorry.
Out of curiosity.
The Kinney signature is both large and sloppy. Yeah, and that's during the war. That's during the war. But it's true that he wouldn't by any means always do that. For me, that was more a signal of the effects of the assassination. Lincoln is a little bit slowed by what had happened in my
It's
story.
interesting. I have a signature right now that I'm sparring over with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum.
Sparring why?
Because they say it's no good, and I think they're dead wrong.
They say it's not authentic, you mean?
Yeah, and I think they're dead wrong.
Well, I can't get into the middle of that.
No, you cannot.
You're the expert, so...
Well, we're having fun with it. I mean, I was interested to find out in Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln some of the historical events that took place. First of all, I was very interested in Lincoln's Folly. I like that idea.
Oh, right.
Since he lived, huh? How did that come about?
Well, I was interested. The Purge of Alaska, of course, we all know is Seward's folly, and I tried to make sure that although there was an impeachment trial going in the United States, the rest of the world was chugging along as it really chugged along. And so occasionally there are references to external events. And Russia sold Alaska because they needed money for these wars they were fighting. And those wars weren't going to change based on whether Lincoln or Johnson was in the White House. The offer to sell Alaska would have come along anyway, and that's why I have it in the novel. We remember it as Seward's folly because Seward pushed it so hard, wisely as it turned out. But in my story, Lincoln is uneasy about buying it. He says, "We just don't have the money. We can't afford it," which is what people said at the time that Seward bought it.
You know, change the subject radically. Brothels take a place in your novel, and there was a book on that about a decade ago that had a map showing where all the brothels were, and 80% of them were between the executive mansion and the Capitol.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, I thought that was very interesting, right there. What do you make of that?
It's true. And I think we're talking about the same book. I have that book with the fold-out map in the back, and I also got a copy of the report of the Provost Marshal General, which was issued in the 1860s, which has the ratings of all the brothels in it, and
ratings,
and so on, ratings, yeah. And so I constructed it from those two things. What we would now think of as, I suppose, the red light district, which was roughly where the Federal Triangle in Washington is now, was known as Hooker's division. It's not really true that prostitutes became known as hookers because of General Hooker. The Oxford English Dictionary tells the name goes back much further than that, but people thought that that was the reason. And so Hooker's division was the nickname for this area where there were actually several hundred brothels squeezed into a relatively small part of the city.
I think how many soldiers were going through.
Well, exactly.
We're thinking congressmen here, and we probably were.
Right. No, that's right. No, there clearly was a there clearly was a customer base that there clearly was demand that they were. Certainly, it's a very violent part of the city, and one of the things in recreating Washington City of the 1860s, one of the things that became apparent was after the Civil War, how much of the city was really run by very violent gangs. A number of them gangs of former soldiers who had no employment, and would go about preying on commerce or on people passing through. And a lot of them still wearing their uniforms, interestingly, because they had no other clothing. They were stuck in and around Washington, and they became basically highwaymen.
Stanton has always been the closet bad guy for Lincoln assassination people, although now that's changed a bit with Otto Eisenschimmel's book, Why Was Lincoln Murdered? That kind of really spurred that on. But did you play on that into the book?
Well, I played on the reader's expectations a little, but I actually have always had a kind of sneaking admiration for Stanton. First of all, he was a brilliant trial lawyer, which we often forget. He and Lincoln sort of tried a case together once, a patent case, and sort of didn't, because Stanton was the big-time lawyer and Lincoln was the nobody, and Stanton treated him like dirt when they were working together in this case. And of course, Stanton also famously defended Dan Sickles, and he did all these other things when Sickles shot his wife's lover in broad daylight and was acquitted on grounds of temporary insanity. But what's interesting to me always about Stanton was that Stanton struck me as kind of a pilot fish. You know, someone once described John Dean of Watergate fame as a pilot fish. The pilot fish are the ones who follow the sharks and eat what the sharks leave in their wake. They follow power. And Stanton had a little bit of that, but I think Stanton also was someone who liked the exercise of power in his own right. I don't think he sought it. I mean, it's fascinating to see a man who goes from Postmaster General, to Secretary. Postmaster General is a much bigger deal than that it is now, but to Secretary of War. I don't think he sought the power in that sense, but he certainly knew how to exercise. And I think one of the reasons that so many conspiracy theorists look at Stanton and say, well, there couldn't have been a conspiracy if Stanton didn't know about it, is because he did hold so much power in his hands. He and Seward really battled for this, how much of behind-the-scenes power they were going to be holding in their hands. I don't think Stanton was conspiring. I don't think anything with Lincoln's assassination. I think that's all nonsense. But in fiction, it is true the reader has a certain expectation that there's going to be someone who in power is going to seem a little sinister, and since many people think Stanton was sinister anyway, who better to seem sinister than Stanton?
I guess, but you met my expectations with Lafayette Baker, Stanton's right-hand thug.
Yeah, and he was.
And he's in here. How did you view him?
Lafayette Baker's a complicated guy. Of course, what I didn't quite have room for is, and Lafayette Baker in real life, Lafayette Baker, should go back and say, was variously the chief of the federal police and various other things, and responsible for the the search for, largely responsible, the search for the Lincoln conspirators after the real assassination, and of course, many people thought that he was responsible for making sure some of them didn't survive their arrests. But in any case, of course, in real life he dies in, I guess, 1868 of poisoning. And some people thought he died of poisoning. For me, in fiction, poisoning is interesting. Maybe he just died of having eaten some bad food. But he dies in real life in 1868. He's accused of investigating Stanton, which is when he falls from power. He has a kind of J. Edgar Hoover quality to him. It was clearly too big for his britches in a lot of ways, and he had no friends in Washington. Well, a character like that, behind-the-scenes conspirator, J. Edgar Hoover type, controlling the federal secret police, in effect, is perfect for a novel like this. I had to find room for him in his pages.
Wow, and he's there. You have a number of interesting stories that are in here that are true, that are relatively unknown. One of them was kind of interesting, the selling of discharge papers. Briefly, give us a...
Yeah, that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. That what happened was people wanted to avoid military service would bribe the provost marshal's staff and get a discharge. You needed a discharge paper so you wouldn't get arrested when you went back north before your term was up. You could be arrested and subject to courts-martial. But the selling discharge papers was apparently pretty widespread. And incidentally, there were a number of efforts to stamp it out, but the histories that I saw suggest that it went on right to the end of the war and even after the end of the war, when a number of people were kept in the Army beyond their enlistment in order to serve in military governments in the South, that the selling discharge papers apparently continued. I'm not sure at what pace, because people weren't really prosecuted for it, even though everybody knew that it went on, so it was natural that I would have a character in the story who had a little hand in the selling of military discharge papers.
Mm-hmm.